Mr. Pons from Spain.
Thank you, Madam President, and if you don't mind, I'm going to try to speak in my language, in Spanish, as we have translation, if you don't mind. So, solo quería hacer una pregunta tanto a la Presidenta como al Secretario General en relación a lo que ha sucedido en las elecciones de Polonia. Yo creo que vale la pena, que merece la pena que se haga una reflexión sobre la idea de que durante la observación electoral, y yo como jefe de misión estaba allí, que haya habido un problema con 30 acreditaciones que se hayan retirado durante 2 días y finalmente se han podido devolver. Me gustaría preguntarle al Secretario General qué se ha hecho después de esa problemática, qué explicaciones ha dado la contraparte polaca, y me gustaría saber qué reflexiones, qué conclusiones se toman cuando se produce un incidente de este tipo, porque estuvimos 48 horas con 30 observadores sin acreditación en un país en el que la observación electoral ya estaba en marcha. Creo que también es importante, porque en un momento de declive de la democracia, ceder a este tipo de situaciones es ser cómplices de esa erosión de la democracia. Por tanto, creo que se resolvió bien, pudimos negociar bien, pudimos recuperar todas las acreditaciones, pero creo que merece una reflexión dentro de la organización cuando se producen este tipo de situaciones, además en un país, en fin, miembro de la Unión Europea, por decirlo de una forma elegante. Muchísimas gracias.
I'm told that there will be an election section at some point, so we can address it at that point. I can just give you what are the principles from our side. I think we consider that all participating states, by making commitments also on election observation missions, they have agreed to invite us, because sometimes we say, are we invited? I think we are always invited. Whether we get a letter or not, we are always invited. This is the first principle. So we are always invited to observe each other's elections. And we are under the assumptions that the country that is being observed does not decide the composition of our delegation. So this is a sovereign, let's say, decision of the president who makes the delegation and those who file registration for the delegation. So the host country should deliver accreditation to everyone. Of course, there are some situations of security. It's a prerogative, more on a national base. But everybody should be invited, and we have made that point also to the Polish authorities. But I think we will go more into the details under the election section later on. But these are the 2 principles: always invited, and everybody needs to be accredited.
And the next one, Mr. Savinuk from Belarus.
Благодарю вас, госпожа председатель. И я также хотел бы высказать благодарность армянской стороне, благодаря которой, благодаря проведению сессии именно в этой стране, наша делегация имеет возможность участвовать в этом мероприятии. Хотел бы еще раз напомнить и привлечь внимание к неприемлемости ситуации, связанной с невозможностью участия белорусской парламентской делегации в работе ежегодной сессии в Ванкувере. Мы крайне разочарованы неспособностью принимающей страны обеспечить полный и равный доступ всех членов Ассамблеи на сессию. Считаем, что реальная, а не декларативная инклюзивность деятельности и процедур Ассамблеи сейчас особенно важны, когда наша организация находится в глубоком кризисе, а мы становимся свидетелями разрушения миропорядка, затрагивающего все сферы международных отношений. По нашему убеждению, парламентская Ассамблея ОБСЕ должна быть площадкой, где обсуждаются, где дебатируются различные, может быть, даже диаметрально противоположные точки зрения. Кроме этого, я хотел бы обратить внимание и на другой одиозный факт, на недопуск белорусского парламентария, члена национальной делегации парламентской ассамблеи ОБСЕ, господина Карася, для участия за наблюдениями за парламентскими выборами в Польше. Это несмотря на то, что он был официально включен в состав наблюдательной миссии парламентской ассамблеи ОБСЕ. Подобные действия подрывают доверие к самой идее инклюзивного наблюдения за выборами под эгидой ОБСЕ. Призываем польскую сторону отменить дискриминационные меры в отношении белорусских парламентариев и не препятствовать полноценному функционированию парламентской ассамблеи ОБСЕ. Такое же предложение имеем в отношении других стран, которые, к сожалению, не в состоянии обеспечить участие всех делегаций на своей территории. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you very much for the question. Again, both on statutory meetings and on election observation missions, the same principle. Everybody is invited and everybody should be accredited. This is the position, of course, of the Assembly. Then the host country has its own prerogatives. But I think we should discuss this because you referred again to the elections in Poland later on in the section on election observation missions, because maybe colleagues from Poland might want to reply. So we will do this later on.
Thank you. And the next one will be Mrs. de Ridder from Germany.
Sehr geehrter Herr Generalsekretär, herzlichen Dank für Ihren Bericht. Sie haben deutlich gemacht, in welcher Systemkrise wir stecken. Und gerade wenn die Generalsekretärin Helga Schmidt nicht wieder bestellt wird, haben wir ein riesiges Problem. Aber das Ganze geht ja um eine Paketlösung. Sie haben deutlich gemacht, dass sowohl ODIHR mit seinem Vorsitzenden bzw. dem Generalsekretär Probleme hat, weiter im Amt zu bleiben, genauso wie die Beauftragten für Minderheitenrechte und Pressefreiheit. Dies zeigt, wie schwierig die Situation ist, in der die OSZE insgesamt steckt. Und wir sollten uns dies sehr bewusst machen und uns auch überlegen, hier in der Parlamentarischen Versammlung, wie wir unsere Dachorganisation stärken können. Es gibt möglicherweise Kompromisslösungen. Nordmazedonien zu verlängern, den Vorsitz zu verlängern, wäre ja eine davon. Aber für kleinere Länder ist es in der Tat schwierig, diese Belastungen auch zu tragen. Und ich würde zumindest hoffen, dass ein Jahr Verlängerung möglich wäre, als Paketlösung dies durchzusetzen. Ich weiß nicht, wie Sie dazu stehen. Vielleicht können Sie noch etwas dazu ausführen. Es gibt ja möglicherweise auch Bedenken von der einen oder anderen Seite gegen einzelne Personen, weil man sich mehr Unterstützung erhofft hat. Auch hier möchte ich noch mal deutlich daran appellieren, diese Bedenken zurückzustellen zugunsten einer Gesamtlösung. Auch hier hätte ich von Ihnen noch gerne eine Kommentierung gehört. Ich will noch einen konkreten Punkt aus Ihrem Bericht auf Seite 3 aufnehmen. Hier haben Sie deutlich gemacht, wo Einsparungen vorgenommen worden sind. Und mich hat erstaunt, aber ich begrüße dies sehr, dass Helsinki plus 50 deutlich reduziert ist. Sie haben geschrieben, dass es sich hier um eine Reduktion von weit mehr als 80% gehört. Das macht im Grunde deutlich, dass eigentlich, ich hoffe, ich interpretiere das richtig, die Arbeit der Gruppe Helsinki plus 50 eingestellt wird. Vielleicht kann man dann tatsächlich umstrukturieren. Ich habe zweimal, glaube ich, daran teilnehmen können. Vielfach waren das ja Online-Meetings. Ich habe den Kostenaufwand nicht immer ganz nachvollziehen können. Aber vielleicht lässt sich dies zugunsten tatsächlich der Tagung und von neuen Ad-Hoc-Komitees umstrukturieren. Diese Idee würde ich auch begrüßen. Auch hier würde ich mir eine Kommentierung von Ihnen wünschen. Den dritten Punkt, die Wahlbeobachtung, das haben Sie schon angesprochen, verlangt natürlich nach Konsequenzen und Bewertungen, aber wir haben ja unter Tagesordnungspunkt 6.1 die Gelegenheit, dies ausführlich zu debattieren. Da werde ich mich dann gerne noch mal zu Wort melden. Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Madam de Ridder. On the OSCE, if you want to hear more, we could spend hours here. I can just give you the gist of the problem. this is the governmental part of the OSCE is an organization that functions by consensus. So the biggest problem is that you need to get all the countries agreeing on something. Now, we are in a very politically divided OSCE, and there is a big problem, well, let's call it what it is. The elephant in the room is that we have sanctions against the Russian Federation. We are very disappointed disappointed maybe is an understatement, with what the Russian Federation is doing in Ukraine and in other parts of the former space. So the problem that we have, that ministers have, is that we have to find consensus, which means we need to somehow also get the Russians on board, but nobody wants to kind of either give them that satisfaction or speak to the Russians about this. So this is where, in a nutshell, the whole thing is blocked. There are different options on the table. There is Austria, which has offered to be the chair, but the EU has always supported Estonia because Estonia had presented a long time the candidatures, but of course Estonia is opposed by Russia. So Estonia cannot go because Russia is opposing Estonia. And the EU cannot leave Estonia behind, and the EU needs to be supportive until the end for Estonia. But Austria is available. The Russian Federation is okay with Austria, but nobody wants to say no to Estonia. Malta is ready to take on this responsibility, and we've heard discussions about this. I don't have updates, and I don't know if the EU would be okay then with Malta, and if then the Russian Federation will be okay with Malta. Kazakhstan was suggested as a possible chair, but apparently the Russian Federation was not happy with Kazakhstan, which is also an oddity. So at the end of the day, you need to get everyone on board. The positions of the Russian Federation is that everything will be decided, the chair and the heads of institutions in Skopje, as long as Minister Lavrov is allowed to fly to Skopje and have meetings there. Now, we have heard that the EU has given a green light to Macedonia to invite Lavrov. I think that the foreign minister of the Russian Federation probably will be in Skopje, and then the situation will be decided there on the spot. But nothing of this is decided. It will be how in the 2 days of the ministerial meeting discussions will take place, and if someone will have a discussion with the Russian Federation and say, can you accept that Macedonia stays, North Macedonia stays for 1 more year, or do you accept that Malta takes on the leadership? But it will require the Russian being on board with that. If there is not okay from the Russian Federation, then the organization will be in a situation where we do not know who is the chair, and definitely there will be a vacuum of leadership in the 4 main positions of this organization. This is very regrettable, but this is the consensus rule. This is the nature of this organization. Again, as I said, luckily in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly we do not have this problem, because we have a president elected by majority, a secretary general elected by majority, so we do not get into this problem at the political and administrative level. But in the governmental side, this is the reality. We're not suggesting that this should change, because the DNA of the OSCE is that it's an organization that rules by consensus. But when you rule by consensus, these are the challenges you have, and that is the reality. On Helsinki Plus 50, I want to reassure you, we are not decommissioning the project. Actually, we are leading the project all the way to Finland in 2025, when the chairmanship of the organization, chairpersonship of the organization will be held by Finland. The reduction that you see is the compensation, part of the compensation that we were giving to Ambassador Zanier, who is no longer working as a permanent consultant, let's say, for the Assembly. So that's where we save the money. But the activity is ongoing, and we will continue some activities. And sometimes Ambassador Zanier has given his availability to continue pro bono, let's say, to support us on these activities. So that's where the reduction comes from. And on EOM, yes, we will do it in the next agenda item.
Thank you, Mr. Montella. Next one will be Lithuania, and Mr. Giedrus Surplus, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, good morning, and thank you once again for Armenia for a wonderful hosting attempt here. I know we will be discussing election observation missions just in a couple of minutes, but just to react to what you said, Mr. General Secretary, dear Roberto, about the probability of maybe monitoring elections next year in Russia and Belarus, if I got it right. And just reacting to what our colleagues from Belarus said, you know, I feel like telling a well-known joke, if I may. The presidential so-called elections once were held in Russia, and there were some confusions when counting the votes. So they invited the experts from Belarus, and the experts did their job, and they announced that the elections in Russia were won by President Lukashenko. So, you know, when speaking about elections and monitoring, which is the one of the main missions of us, OSCE, I would like to say or suggest that you know, there are elections that probably don't need to be observed because they are fair and free, and everybody knows that. There are elections that should be observed, and we do that with all respect to the countries that invite us. But there are elections that cannot be observed because they simply are not elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Of course, I never meant the Russian Federation as a possibility for us to observe. We thought that as the ODIHR is conducting probably a need assessment mission in Minsk to consider whether they might find grounds for observing in Belarus, also because this was a kind of the wish from the Belarusian opposition, we thought that maybe it's worth just having a discussion in the Bureau. I think at the end what you're saying is what will happen. I don't think we will also observe the elections in Belarus. On a personal note, I think that I agree with you that there are some elections where the outcome is not in doubt, where sometimes it's not even worth spending resources. But again, this is a political decision of the Bureau, so I think we should give them the chance to debate this in the Bureau in Skopje. Thank you.
Thank you. And next one goes to Ukraine, Mr. Poturayev.
Dear colleagues, let's remind for a second all the debates this morning. They show that we are facing maybe the deepest, the most dangerous crisis in the history of this organization. Just let's hear ourselves. Mr. Lavrov is going to Skopje to let this organization to work. Mr. Lavrov goes to Skopje to save OSCE. How does it sound like? I don't know what future can be in the organization which will be the hostage of aggressor state, which started full-scale war in the center of Europe, which committed multiple war crimes. Am I going to be hostage of Russians in this organization? No. Are my colleagues are going to be? Or a lot of other colleagues? I think no. It will be very sorry if this meeting will be the last one, because we still believe in Ukraine that this organization could be very important and useful for resolving a lot of problems that we, all people on our planet, are facing. But let's accept our challenges and our problems seriously. And let's really think about effective steps against authoritarian regimes, against tyrants, against aggressors and occupants. Let's think about amendments that could change the future of our organization and other international organizations so that they could be really effective teams of politicians and states and not hostages of gangsters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Mikita. Indeed, the organization works by consensus, so the governmental part of the organization is somehow hostage of the consensus rule. So is the UN Security Council. The way out of it is that we need to be creative. So I think at the governmental side, they have to find a way to be creative to come out of the difficulties if they want to keep the organization alive, of course. I mean, there is also other options. When you say we need to find, instead of being hostages, we need to find effective steps against the aggressor or the tyrant, as you say, I think this is the way. And in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, we have found effective steps to sanction those who are in violation of the Helsinki Final Act and the OSCE commitments. And we have done this, and I've said this several times in this forum. We have been providing sanctions against the Russian Federation for the last 14 years. From the last 14 years, from 2010, there is no longer a Russian in the Bureau of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, where politicians have voted against any Russian candidate. So you exercise your right, political right, to sanction the Russians from 2010. There is no longer a vice president. Always there was in this Parliamentary Assembly a tradition that the president of the Duma was also a vice president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. This doesn't happen anymore from 2010. And from 2014, after the illegal annexation of Crimea, every document that the Russians have presented, like supplementary items, have been voted down by this assembly. So you've exercised your political power to sanction the Russians. You didn't pass their documents. The Russians, on the other side, have never managed to block us. In the OSCE governmental side, they can say the agenda is not accepted, hence the meeting cannot take place, or this venue is not accepted, hence the conference cannot take place. In the Parliamentary Assembly, we have never been blocked. Our budget has always been passed. Our meetings have always taken place, and our resolution every year since 2014, we have called what the Russians did in Crimea a clear, gross, uncorrected violation of the Helsinki Final Act. We named the country. We didn't say a participating state. We said committed by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. And this was a resolution presented by Ben Cardin, US Congressman Ben Cardin, in 2014. And we have reiterated this resolution every year, including now recently in Vancouver. So I think in an organization that rules by consensus, where it's difficult to come out, we should exploit the comparative advantage, which is this Parliamentary Assembly, to exactly do the political work and the sanctions that realistically we can deliver at our level. The sanctions we can deliver at our level are political sanctions, statements, demarches, voting down documents, not voting for Russian members, and criticizing them whenever they are present, as it happened in Vienna very strongly. So I think in this Parliamentary Assembly, I'm very proud of the track record that we've had, notwithstanding the difficulties in a consensual organization we have, to at least be very effective and deliver the sanctions that we could at our level. And I think we have really exhausted the arsenal of possible tools that we have within the Parliamentary Assembly to exercise sanctions from our side.
Thank you. And the next one goes to Austria, Mr. Lopatka.
Now it works. Okay. So thank you very much for giving me the floor, and let me start with the intervention of my friend Mikita Potorayev. And after such a long time of war and atrocities, I fully understand him, and we will never accept to be a hostage of the Russians, of course. But on the other side, I hope, Mikita, we can agree that we want to have a future for OSCE. as a special organization, as a platform for dialogue. This dialogue is not possible now, but I have to tell you, some weeks ago, we had the assembly of IPU, and Russian and Ukrainian parliamentarians were for days in one room, and I was there appointed to join this committee working on the dialogue between Ukraine and Russia. And Mikita, you know it. A delegation was already in the past in Ukraine and in Russia, a delegation of IPU. So we have to be fair with OSCE, I think. On the one hand, there's a big difference between the Council of Europe and OSCE, how I see it. And in the Council of Europe, also with my vote, I supported it to expel Russia. But I will never do it here in OSCE, because I think an OSCE, on the long run, without Russia, such a huge and big country, and we speak of the security of Europe, we need a form to have open channels for a dialogue. And it is very difficult now to find here the right position. But I only want, because the seat of OSCE is in Vienna, to ask all of you, let's do everything that we have the chance to have this dialogue. If we don't have this chance, what is the alternative? The alternative for us
is their contribution, and I think I would like to thank Iceland and Estonia, I think, who have already made that commitment this year, and many others who have already made that commitment, but they can only do it from the next budget cycle because of budgetary reasons. So I think this is one way of being creative and trying to bring additional resources in the Secretariat. That's all.
Thank you. And we still have one question coming from Latvia. Mr. Kols, please.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, I wasn't planning to have my intervention at this part of our agenda, but Mr. Lopatka obviously triggered certain, not only emotions, but practicalities. Obviously, I'm not going to argue. If that is conviction of Mr. Lopatka in Austria, no matter what, to have a dialogue. Colleagues, I have a suggestion. It's a very practical suggestion. Obviously, there may be more in OSCE who seek to have a dialogue under current circumstances with the Russian Federation. We should appoint a special representative from the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly who should conduct these relationships. And I suggest that Mr. Lopatka would be an ideal candidate. And I would expect that he would commute regularly from Vienna to Moscow to facilitate that dialogue and report back to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, from which then we can assess, is there a room for a dialogue or not. Colleagues, I ask you to support this suggestion, and I think then we can close the discussion, should we have dialogue or not. We will have a special representative, but particularly trying to facilitate that dialogue. Thank you.
I think it's a question more for the President than for the Assembly. Yeah, we can take that into consideration. Actually, Mr. Lopatka, you were before the special rep on parliamentary dialogue, so basically just restarting your old mandate, but it's up to the President.
Thank you, dear Roberto, for your report and also for all the questions and answers given to them.